My girlfriend said she needed to comfort her ex because his sister was in a serious car accident, but something about the whole situation felt rehearsed. I'd been with Callie for 3 years, and I thought I knew her patterns by now, but this was different. I'm a custom bicycle frame builder in Minneapolis, someone who works with my hands and believes in straightforward communication, so when something doesn't align properly, I notice. Callie had been distant for weeks, spending more time at her yoga studio and coming home with stories about her instructor friends and their relationship dramas that somehow always circled back to how men don't understand emotional intelligence. I should have paid more attention to how often Hunter's name started appearing in these conversations, always prefaced with dismissive comments about how pathetic her ex-boyfriend had become since their breakup 2 years ago. The messages started on a Tuesday morning while I was in my shop, carefully measuring steel tubing for a touring bike commission. Callie's phone kept buzzing on the kitchen counter when I went inside for coffee, and I couldn't help but notice the name Hunter lighting up the screen repeatedly. When I mentioned it, she brushed it off as him going through a rough patch and needing someone to talk to, which seemed reasonable enough until the calls became daily occurrences that she took in private, stepping out onto our fire escape where I'd been growing a collection of succulents that reminded me of the stability I wanted to build in our relationship. The conversations grew longer each day, and I watched Callie transform from annoyed to concerned to something that looked suspiciously like excited anticipation. When she finally told me about the sister's accident, everything about her delivery felt scripted. She explained that Hunter was devastated, completely falling apart, and couldn't cope with the trauma alone because his family lived across the country and he had no one else to turn to for emotional support. According to Callie, he'd specifically asked for her because she understood him in ways no one else could, and she felt obligated to help him process his grief since they'd maintained a friendship after their breakup. The story had all the right emotional beats, but something in her eyes reminded me of the look she got when she was planning a surprise or trying to justify an expensive yoga retreat she couldn't afford. I suggested that if Hunter needed support, maybe she could meet him somewhere public, like a coffee shop, where she could offer comfort without it becoming an overnight emotional marathon. Callie's reaction was immediate and defensive, explaining that Hunter owned a lakeside cabin about 2 hours north of the city where he'd retreated to deal with his sister's condition, and he was too fragile to leave that safe space. She insisted that real emotional healing required privacy and uninterrupted time, not the superficial comfort of a quick coffee meeting, and she needed to be there for him because that's what evolved, emotionally mature people do for each other. The way she framed my concerns as controlling and possessive made me question my own instincts, which I now realize was exactly her intention. I tried explaining that my discomfort wasn't about jealousy but about the secretive nature of spending an entire night alone with an ex-boyfriend in an isolated location, especially when their relationship had ended because of his emotional manipulation and inability to commit. Callie responded by accusing me of displaying toxic masculinity and projecting my own insecurities onto her healing work, reminding me that she'd spent years in therapy learning to set healthy boundaries and recognize manipulative behavior. She talked about how disappointed she was that I couldn't trust her judgment after 3 years together, and how my lack of faith in her emotional intelligence revealed deep-seated issues with my own masculinity that I needed to address if we were going to have a future together. The argument escalated when I pointed out that healthy boundaries would actually prevent someone from rushing to comfort an ex-boyfriend overnight, especially when that ex had a history of creating crisis situations to regain attention from former partners. Callie's face changed completely, shifting from defensive to cold and calculating, and she told me that my inability to understand the complexity of human emotion proved we were fundamentally incompatible. She started packing an overnight bag with deliberate dramatic flair, choosing items that seemed designed to make a statement about her independence, including the silk pajamas I'd bought her for her birthday and the expensive face cream she only used for special occasions. As I watched her pack, I experienced a moment of absolute clarity about our relationship that felt like suddenly seeing the frame geometry I'd been struggling with for weeks. Every conversation we'd had about commitment, every discussion about our future, every time she'd made me feel like I was failing to meet some emotional standard she'd set, all of it crystallized into understanding that we fundamentally valued different things. I wanted partnership built on transparency and mutual respect, while she thrived on drama and emotional complexity that always seemed to center around her needs and her growth at the expense of everyone else's comfort and security. When she turned at the door to deliver what felt like a prepared speech about how real love means supporting each other's healing journeys without jealousy or possessiveness, I realized that nothing I could say would penetrate the narrative she'd constructed around this situation. She'd already decided that I was the controlling boyfriend preventing her from being her authentic self, and Hunter was the wounded soul who needed her unique brand of emotional rescue. The engagement ring I'd been hiding in my sock drawer for 2 months suddenly felt like evidence of how completely I'd misread our entire relationship and what kind of future she actually wanted with me. After she left, I sat in our downtown Minneapolis apartment surrounded by the life we'd built together, from the vintage record collection we'd been curating to the custom bike components I'd been storing for her dream touring bicycle that we'd planned to build together next summer. Everything felt contaminated by the realization that while I'd been planning our future, she'd been maintaining emotional connections that prioritized her past over our present. I understood then that this wasn't really about Hunter's sister or emergency emotional support, but about Callie needing to feel wanted and necessary in ways that our stable, committed relationship apparently couldn't provide. Instead of spending the night pacing our apartment or calling her friends for updates, I did something that surprised even me in its clarity and finality. I started packing my tools with the same methodical precision I used when building custom frames, each piece carefully wrapped and stored in the cases I'd organized over years of building my craft. My vintage Campagnolo components went into their original boxes, my collection of steel tubing got secured in protective sleeves, and my precision measuring tools were cleaned and placed in the foam-lined case my sister Brooke had given me when I started my business. There was something almost meditative about dismantling 3 years of shared life with the same care I put into creating something beautiful and functional, except this time I was building an exit strategy instead of a future. The succulent garden I'd been nurturing on our fire escape required the most delicate handling, each plant representing months of patient care and attention to detail that Callie had dismissed as my quirky hobby rather than recognizing it as evidence of my commitment to growing things slowly and sustainably. I wrapped each pot in newspaper and arranged them in boxes with the same consideration I gave to transporting delicate bike frames, knowing that these small living things deserved better than being abandoned just because their caretaker was leaving. My vintage record collection filled 6 milk crates, each album a memory of Sunday mornings when Callie and I would play music while she practiced yoga and I sketched new frame designs, back when our differences felt complementary rather than incompatible. The engagement ring I'd been hiding in my sock drawer for 2 months felt heavier than any of the steel I worked with daily, a symbol of how completely I'd misread her commitment to our relationship and her vision of our future together. I placed it on the kitchen counter next to a simple note that read "Good luck with everything," because anything more elaborate would have implied I expected a response or wanted to continue the conversation she'd already ended by choosing Hunter's emotional crisis over our relationship's boundaries. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through our kitchen window, casting small rainbows on the counter where we'd shared so many meals and planned so many adventures that would never happen. My sister Brooke lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown, in a house she'd bought after her divorce with the kind of practical wisdom I was starting to appreciate more deeply. When I showed up at her door with my truck loaded with everything I owned, she took one look at my face and started making coffee without asking for explanations or offering unsolicited advice about relationships and second chances. Brooke understood that some decisions don't require discussion, just execution, and she helped me carry boxes into her spare room with the efficiency of someone who'd also learned to recognize when a situation was beyond repair. By the time Callie returned from her emergency counseling session with Hunter, I had disappeared so completely from our shared space that it probably felt like I'd never existed there at all. No angry notes, no dramatic confrontations, no attempts to make her feel guilty about her choices or beg her to reconsider the path she'd chosen. I'd simply removed myself and everything that belonged to me, leaving behind only the engagement ring and the note, clean and final as a properly executed weld that would never need reinforcement or repair. The silence I left behind was more powerful than any argument I could have made about trust, boundaries, or the difference between supporting someone's healing and enabling their manipulation of crisis situations. That night at Brooke's house, I slept better than I had in months, not because I was happy about losing 3 years of my life to someone who saw me as secondary to her emotional adventures, but because I'd finally stopped pretending that compromise meant accepting behavior that fundamentally violated my values. I'd spent so long trying to be the understanding boyfriend who supported Callie's growth and healing journey that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my own boundaries respected and my own emotional needs considered as equally important. The relief of no longer having to justify my reasonable expectations or apologize for wanting a partner who prioritized our relationship over maintaining intimate connections with ex-boyfriends was profound and immediate. The next morning, I turned off my phone and spent the day in Brooke's garage, organizing my tools and planning the independent bike shop I'd been dreaming about for years but had never pursued because Callie thought entrepreneurship was too risky for our financial stability. For the first time in months, I felt excited about my future instead of anxious about managing someone else's emotional crises and maintaining a relationship that required me to constantly prove my worth and understanding. I realized that while Callie was at Hunter's cabin discovering whether her ex-boyfriend's emergency was real or manufactured, I was rediscovering who I was when I wasn't walking on eggshells around someone who treated my commitment as a given while keeping her options perpetually open. When I finally turned my phone back on 3 days later, I discovered that Callie had created a digital hurricane of panic that would have been flattering if it wasn't so obviously driven by her need to control the narrative rather than genuine concern for my well-being. Her messages started apologetic and confused, claiming she'd returned from helping Hunter to find me mysteriously vanished without explanation, as if my note and the engagement ring weren't clear enough communication for someone who prided herself on emotional intelligence. The progression of her texts revealed everything I needed to know about how she processed the situation, beginning with bewilderment that I'd overreacted to her helping a friend in crisis, escalating to anger that I'd abandoned our relationship without giving her a chance to explain, and finally landing on manipulation tactics that painted me as emotionally unstable and unable to handle adult communication. Her Instagram stories became a masterclass in passive-aggressive social media performance, featuring cryptic quotes about misunderstandings and men who run away when relationships require real work, interspersed with photos of her practicing yoga in locations that seemed designed to show how zen and unbothered she was by my dramatic exit. She posted pictures of our empty apartment with captions about how some people choose silence over growth, and shared inspirational memes about toxic masculinity and emotional unavailability that her yoga instructor friends enthusiastically supported with comments about dodging bullets and knowing her worth. The irony of someone who'd spent a night at her ex-boyfriend's cabin lecturing me about emotional maturity wasn't lost on me, but I recognized the performance for what it was and refused to engage with content designed to provoke a response. The voicemails she left revealed the real story behind her emergency counseling session with Hunter, delivered in a tone that suggested I should be grateful for her honesty rather than appalled by her poor judgment. Hunter's sister had never been in an accident, a detail that emerged when Callie mentioned almost offhandedly that he'd needed support because he was struggling with depression and had created the crisis to get her attention, something she framed as evidence of how much he still cared about her rather than recognizing it as textbook manipulation. She explained that he'd tried to rekindle their relationship during her visit, professing his love and begging her to leave me for a second chance at what they'd shared, but she'd turned him down, and that's when he'd abandoned her at the cabin without transportation, forcing her to call a rideshare service for the 2-hour trip back to Minneapolis. Her expectation that I should be proud of her for rejecting Hunter's advances rather than horrified that she'd put herself in that position revealed how completely she'd missed the point of my concerns and boundaries. She kept emphasizing that nothing physical had happened between them, as if the emotional infidelity and deception were irrelevant compared to whether they'd actually slept together, completely ignoring the fact that she'd lied to me about the nature of her emergency and chosen to spend a night alone with an ex-boyfriend who'd specifically engineered the situation to win her back. The way she told the story made it sound like she deserved credit for eventually making the right choice rather than accepting responsibility for creating the problem in the first place. When her individual appeals failed to generate the response she wanted, Callie escalated to enlisting her yoga instructor friends in what she called an intervention but felt more like an ambush designed to shame me into returning to a relationship I'd already definitively ended. 3 of them showed up at my bike shop on a busy Saturday afternoon, interrupting my work with a professional cycling team commissioned to deliver prepared speeches about forgiveness, communication, and the importance of fighting for love instead of running away when things get complicated. They spoke in the therapeutic language Callie had taught them, referencing attachment styles and trauma responses as if my decision to leave was evidence of psychological damage rather than healthy self-respect and boundary enforcement. The leader of this intervention was Maya, Callie's closest friend and the owner of the yoga studio where they developed their shared philosophy about evolved relationships and conscious communication, concepts that apparently didn't include basic honesty about overnight trips with manipulative ex-boyfriends. Maya explained that Callie was devastated by my sudden disappearance and couldn't understand why I'd chosen to end 3 years together without giving her an opportunity to make amends for what she insisted was a misunderstanding rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust. She suggested that my refusal to engage in dialogue about our relationship proved I was afraid of the vulnerability required for real intimacy, a diagnosis that would have been more convincing if it came from someone who hadn't enabled Callie's self-centered behavior for years. I listened politely to their concerns and thanked them for caring about Callie's happiness, but I made it clear that my decision was final and not subject to group discussion or therapeutic intervention from people who didn't understand the situation or my values. I explained that healthy relationships don't require constant negotiation about basic respect and boundaries, and that someone who needed her friends to convince her ex-boyfriend to take her back probably wasn't ready for the kind of partnership I wanted to build with someone. The look of shock on their faces when I calmly defended my choice to prioritize my own well-being over Callie's comfort was worth enduring their disappointed lectures about modern men and fear of commitment. 6 months later, I was living a completely different life in northeast Minneapolis, where I'd found the perfect space for my independent bike shop in a converted warehouse that still smelled like the wood furniture that had been crafted there for decades. The building had character that matched my vision for handcrafted touring bikes, with exposed brick walls and large windows that flooded my workspace with natural light perfect for detailed frame construction and custom paint jobs. My specialty became adventure touring bikes for people who wanted to explore the country at a pace that allowed them to actually see and experience the places they traveled through, bikes built for comfort over thousands of miles rather than speed over short distances. My client base grew through word of mouth from cyclists who appreciated craftsmanship and understood that quality work takes time and attention to detail rather than rushing to meet artificial deadlines or cutting corners to maximize profit. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my relationship with Callie, people who shared my interests in sustainable transportation and outdoor adventures but whom she dismissed as boring because they preferred hiking and camping to yoga retreats and consciousness-raising workshops. The professional cycling team commission I'd been working on led to opportunities with other serious riders who needed custom solutions for their specific body geometry and riding style, work that challenged my technical skills and reminded me why I'd fallen in love with frame building in the first place. When Callie ambushed me at my favorite coffee roastery in early summer, I was reviewing sketches for a tandem touring bike that a couple from Oregon had commissioned for their retirement adventure across the Pacific coast. She'd clearly been tracking my routine through social media or mutual friends, positioning herself at a corner table where she could intercept me before I noticed her presence and potentially left without the confrontation she'd obviously planned. Her appearance was carefully orchestrated to suggest casual confidence, but I could see the nervous energy in how she kept adjusting her hair and checking her reflection in her phone screen while pretending to read a book about mindfulness and healing trauma. Her opening gambit was to compliment my obvious success and independence, acknowledging that I seemed happier and more fulfilled than I'd been during our relationship, comments delivered in a tone that suggested she deserved credit for my growth rather than recognizing that my improvement came from escaping her influence. When I responded with the same polite interest I'd show any acquaintance asking about my work, treating her exactly like a former neighbor rather than someone who'd shared my bed and planned a future with me, her carefully maintained composure began to crack around the edges. Her demand for closure and explanation for my emotional abandonment revealed that she still fundamentally misunderstood what had happened between us, framing my departure as cruel punishment rather than recognizing it as the logical consequence of her choices and priorities. She accused me of treating our 3-year relationship like it meant nothing, of discarding her without giving her a chance to grow from her mistakes, as if the problem had been a single error in judgment rather than a pattern of behavior that prioritized her emotional needs over our relationship's boundaries. The fact that she still couldn't articulate what specifically she'd done wrong, instead focusing on my reaction as disproportionate and emotionally immature, confirmed that leaving had been the right decision and that no amount of time or therapy would bridge the gap between our fundamental values. My peaceful demeanor and obvious contentment seemed to infuriate her more than any angry confrontation could have, because it proved that I hadn't been destroyed by losing her, hadn't spent months pining for her return, and hadn't learned any lessons about the importance of fighting for love regardless of how poorly I was treated. She'd clearly expected to find me bitter, lonely, or at least struggling with the consequences of walking away from someone as special as she considered herself to be. Instead, she discovered that I'd thrived in her absence, built something meaningful with my life, and moved forward without looking back or carrying resentment about her choices. The reality that I was genuinely better off without her was something she seemed completely unprepared to process or accept with any grace. When she finally left the coffee shop, clearly frustrated by my refusal to engage in the dramatic reconciliation scene she'd orchestrated, I returned to my sketches with the same focus I'd brought to every aspect of my new life. The tandem bike project represented everything I valued about real partnership, two people working together toward a shared adventure, trusting each other completely because they'd built that trust through consistent actions rather than demanding it through emotional manipulation and therapeutic language about growth and healing. Nearly a year after our breakup, Callie sent me a carefully crafted email through my business website that read like a graduate thesis in psychology rather than genuine communication from someone who'd shared 3 years of my life. Her message opened with acknowledgement of my need for space and respect for my boundaries, phrases that felt rehearsed and calculated rather than authentic, before launching into a detailed analysis of her own attachment disorders and boundary issues that she claimed extensive therapy had helped her understand and address. She used specific psychological terminology about anxious attachment styles and emotional regulation techniques, presenting herself as someone who'd done the hard work of self-examination and emerged as a fundamentally different person who deserved consideration and possibly forgiveness. The email referenced specific memories from our relationship with surgical precision, mentioning the succulent garden I'd tended on our fire escape and how she'd never properly appreciated my nurturing nature, the vintage records we'd collected together, and how she'd taken for granted my knowledge and passion for music history. Each memory was presented as proof that she now understood what she'd lost and had developed the emotional intelligence to appreciate what I'd offered, as if the problem had been her inability to see my value rather than her unwillingness to prioritize our relationship over her own emotional adventures. She described her therapy sessions in detail that felt uncomfortably intimate, sharing insights about how her childhood trauma had created patterns of seeking validation through drama and crisis, and how she'd unconsciously sabotaged our stable partnership because it felt too safe to be real. The clinical language she used to describe her behavior patterns suggested she'd memorized her therapist's explanations rather than genuinely internalized them, turning her healing process into another performance designed to achieve a specific outcome rather than authentic growth. Her request for a meeting was framed as part of her healing process, explaining that her therapist had recommended making amends with people she'd hurt during her period of emotional dysfunction, and that my continued silence was preventing her from fully processing her guilt and shame about how she'd treated me. The way she positioned my potential refusal as an obstacle to her healing revealed that she still saw our interaction primarily in terms of what she needed rather than considering whether engaging with her would serve any purpose for my own well-being. The email included subtle implications that we'd both made mistakes in our relationship, suggesting that while she'd done the work to understand and correct her patterns, I might also benefit from examining my own contribution to our communication problems. She mentioned reading articles about men's difficulties with vulnerability and intimacy, recommending books that might help me understand how my own defense mechanisms had prevented us from working through our challenges together. The suggestion that I shared responsibility for our relationship's failure, delivered in the gentle language of therapeutic insight, was perhaps the most manipulative aspect of her entire message. I read the email once while drinking my morning coffee, recognizing it immediately as another attempt to regain control over our narrative and re-establish contact under the guise of personal growth and accountability. I deleted the email without responding and blocked her business website contact form, understanding that any acknowledgement would restart the cycle of manipulation and boundary testing that I'd escaped by leaving in the first place. Real healing doesn't require forgiveness from the people you've hurt, and genuine accountability means accepting that some consequences are permanent regardless of how much personal work you've done. The fact that she'd spent nearly a year in therapy but still couldn't resist reaching out to manipulate my response to her healing journey proved that her fundamental character hadn't changed at all. She was still the same person who'd prioritized her emotional needs over our relationship's boundaries, just armed with better vocabulary and more sophisticated tactics for getting what she wanted from people who'd moved on from her influence. At my sister Brooke's wedding reception at a historic mansion in Stillwater, I was enjoying conversation with her new husband's family when I spotted a familiar emerald dress across the candlelit ballroom that made my stomach drop with recognition. Callie had somehow managed to attend as the +1 of our mutual friend Sarah, a connection I hadn't considered when Brooke sent out invitations months earlier. She looked stunning in that calculated way she'd perfected, positioned near the bar where she could observe the entire reception while appearing casually social and unbothered by my presence. The timing of her approach during cocktail hour felt deliberate and strategic, waiting until I was standing alone near the dessert table while my girlfriend Emma was in the restroom, creating the perfect opportunity for a private conversation that wouldn't seem engineered or desperate to the other wedding guests. Emma was a documentary filmmaker I'd met during a bike touring workshop 6 months earlier, someone whose intelligence and independence reminded me what healthy partnership actually looked like, and I'd been looking forward to introducing her to my family without the complexity of past relationships intruding on our happiness. Callie's opening comments were perfectly calibrated compliments about how successful and content I appeared, observations delivered with warm familiarity that suggested we'd remained close friends rather than acknowledging the reality that I'd completely cut contact with her over a year ago. Her fishing expedition for information about my personal life was conducted with subtle skill, asking seemingly casual questions about whether I was enjoying the single life or had started dating anyone seriously, inquiries delivered with the kind of concerned interest that a caring friend might show rather than an ex-girlfriend desperately trying to assess whether I'd moved on completely. When Emma returned from the restroom and I introduced her as my girlfriend, the change in Callie's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable, her practiced smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered her composure and shifted into a different performance entirely. Emma was everything Callie wasn't, professionally accomplished without needing to center every conversation around her own achievements, emotionally stable without requiring constant validation and crisis management, and genuinely interested in other people's experiences rather than viewing every interaction as an opportunity to showcase her own complexity and depth. The contrast between them was stark and clearly visible to anyone paying attention, Emma's natural confidence and warmth highlighting Callie's performative energy and desperate need to control the social dynamics of every situation she entered. Emma graciously complimented Callie's dress and asked polite questions about her connection to the bride, displaying the kind of secure, unbothered behavior that comes from someone who doesn't view other women as threats or competition but simply as fellow human beings worthy of basic courtesy and respect. Callie's attempt to create some kind of dramatic tension backfired completely when Emma smoothly suggested we should all dance together since the band was playing such beautiful music, an invitation that transformed what Callie had intended as a private confrontation into a public social interaction where her emotional manipulation tactics couldn't gain traction. As the evening progressed, I watched Callie struggle to find her footing in a situation where she couldn't position herself as the victim, forced instead to witness firsthand that I'd not only moved on completely but had found someone whose company I genuinely enjoyed without constant drama or emotional labor. Emma later told me that Callie had approached her near the coat check and attempted to plant seeds of doubt about my commitment issues and emotional availability, suggesting that I had patterns of running away when relationships became challenging. Emma's response had been to thank Callie for her concern and then mention how much she appreciated my consistency and reliability, effectively shutting down the conversation without engaging in the drama Callie had tried to create. The last I saw of Callie that night, she was standing alone by the dessert table, checking her phone with frantic energy while Emma and I danced to the band's final set with the easy comfort of two people who'd found something real and sustainable together. The contrast between my current happiness and the emotional exhaustion I'd experienced during my relationship with Callie was so profound that I felt genuinely grateful for her betrayal, understanding that her inability to prioritize our relationship had freed me to find someone who actually wanted the same kind of partnership I'd been trying to build. Emma's grace under pressure, her refusal to be drawn into petty competition or drama, and her genuine interest in building something meaningful together reminded me what healthy love actually looked like when both people shared the same values and commitment to each other's well-being. Watching Callie's desperate attempts to create chaos in a situation where she had no power or relevance was almost sad, like seeing someone still trying to play a game that everyone else had moved on from years ago. As autumn settled over Minneapolis with its familiar rhythm of changing leaves and cooler evenings, Emma and I spent our weekends planning a joint documentary project about sustainable transportation communities across the country, combining her filmmaking expertise with my knowledge of cycling culture to create something that would showcase the people building alternatives to car-dependent lifestyles. The project represented everything I valued about real partnership, two people bringing their individual skills and passions together to create something neither could accomplish alone, working toward shared goals that excited both of us rather than compromising our authentic interests to accommodate someone else's vision. Our plans included a cross-country cycling expedition that would take us through small towns and urban communities where people had chosen bicycles and walkable neighborhoods over the isolation and expense of car ownership, documenting the stories of families and individuals who discovered that slower, more intentional ways of moving through the world actually increased their quality of life and connection to their communities. The irony that I was planning adventures with someone who shared my values while Callie had dismissed my interests as boring wasn't lost on me, but it no longer carried any sting of regret, just gratitude for the clarity that her rejection had ultimately provided. One evening in late October, I was closing up my bike shop after a long day of working on custom frames when I noticed Callie's car parked across the street, the same white sedan she'd been driving during our relationship, positioned where she could observe my routine without being immediately visible. The sight of her car didn't trigger anxiety or curiosity about what she might want or how long she'd been watching, just a mild sense of inconvenience, like noticing a parking meter had expired. I finished my closing routine with the same methodical attention I brought to every aspect of my work and walked to my truck without looking in her direction or acknowledging her presence. The realization that Callie had become completely irrelevant to my emotional landscape felt like the final confirmation that I'd successfully built a life that didn't require her approval, attention, or even her absence to feel complete and satisfying. She was no longer someone who could hurt me, anger me, or even interest me enough to wonder what her motivations might be for sitting outside my business, just a person from my past who hadn't learned to accept that some stories end definitively without sequels or redemption arcs. Emma was waiting for me at home with takeout from our favorite Vietnamese restaurant and sketches for our documentary's opening sequence, her excitement about our project infectious and genuine in ways that reminded me daily why I'd been willing to risk loving someone again after Callie's betrayal. We spent the evening reviewing footage she'd shot of Minneapolis bike infrastructure and planning interview questions for community organizers we'd be meeting in Portland and Austin, conversations that flowed naturally between personal and professional interests because our relationship was built on shared values rather than constant negotiation. The following morning, Emma and I loaded our bikes onto my truck for a weekend camping trip to test gear for our cross-country expedition, the kind of adventure that combined our shared interests with practical preparation for our documentary project. As we drove out of the city toward the state park where we'd reserved a campsite, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically according to your own values rather than constantly managing someone else's emotional crises and unrealistic expectations. I never saw Callie's car outside my shop again, and I realized with something approaching wonder that I'd completely stopped thinking about her except in moments like these when I wanted to appreciate how much better my life had become since her departure. She'd become a character in a story I'd finished reading and filed away, someone who'd taught me important lessons about boundaries and self-respect, but who no longer had any role in the chapters one was currently writing with someone who actually deserved the effort I put into building a sustainable, loving relationship. The difference between my life with Callie and my life with Emma was the difference between constantly defending my worth and having it recognized naturally, between justifying my reasonable expectations and having them met without explanation. Emma didn't need therapeutic language or conscious effort to treat me with respect and consideration. It was simply who she was, just as my commitment to her came from genuine appreciation rather than obligation or fear of losing someone who made me feel lucky to have them.